ESG. This three-letter acronym has the potential to transform the face of social care. But what is ESG and how does it relate to the care sector? Not only that, but why do all care leaders need to develop an understanding of ESG well enough so that they can build it into their organization-wide strategy? To begin the journey of understanding the ESG landscape and its implications for the care sector, I invited Deborah Rowntree from Bevan Brittan to come and speak to me. I'm Simon Parker, and this is the Care Leaders Network podcast. ESG strategy. What, why, and how? So, Deborah, tell me, what exactly is ESG?
So ESG stands for environmental, social and governance, and it's really intended to be a way or a set of standards for measuring an organisation's impact on the environment and society, and to look at how transparent and accountable an organisation is. So if you take each element in turn, environmental criteria really covers the management of environmental risks by an organisation. So more specifically looking at things like energy use, carbon emissions, waste management. And it's this sort of element of ESG is really relevant to businesses that hold a number of property assets. So it is particularly relevant to the care sector. And, you know, examples we've seen of businesses making progress in this area is sort of looking across their portfolios of properties at what can be done to reduce carbon emissions and improve energy efficiency, be that through improving glazing or insulation, or maybe replacing gas boilers with alternative sources of energy, and also possibly looking at implementing the use of electric vehicles if they use a lot of vehicles in their organisation. Social criteria relates much more to impact on the community. So undoubtedly, you know, the care sector has an inherent social value and is well placed to sort of demonstrate this criteria. But that's exactly what this is about. It's about demonstrating that against an objective set of targets, showing, for example, how you treat your employees. Do you have a staff wellbeing programme? Are you doing things to support the training and development of your workforce? And looking at how sort of diverse and inclusive you are as an organisation. And then the final pillar of sort of ESG is governance, and that looks much more at sort of quality, suitability and performance of boards of organisations and policies that they have in place. So the fact that as a sector care is heavily regulated should in theory help with this, as a lot of organisations should have a good minimum standard of governance in order to satisfy CQC requirements. But this is really about improving the way organisations are run and demonstrating that to others. And I guess, Simon, the reason why we're kind of talking about ESG and why it really is relevant is that this is something we're seeing investors focus a lot more on and look at a business's ESG credentials when they decide whether or not to invest in them. I know I'm certainly having a lot more discussions with funders and investors that I work with about this, but I think it's fair to say it's an area where the sector is a bit behind other sectors in terms of organisations having strategies and plans in place for this. I think there was a survey carried out by CBRE last year that found that less than 50% of care providers had any kind of ESG strategy or plan, which, you know, is understandable and maybe not really surprising given the challenges that the sector's faced in recent years. But it's really now becoming important for a variety of reasons for organisations to really start thinking about their credentials in terms of ESG and how they can demonstrate those.
Thank you for just break down on that. I think that was really, really helpful. Interesting what you said about the fact that the 50% of care providers don't yet have an ESG strategy. I've spoken to quite a few care leaders in the last 6-12 months who are actually using ESG, the kind of the fundamentals of the framework, if you like, to try and help shake off some of the kind of the COVID overhang almost, to be able to try and invigorate with their team to try and, obviously, of course, the pandemic was tragic and deeply traumatic for an awful lot of people. It put an immense amount of pressure on the care sector. But the care leaders that I've been speaking to about this have kind of, they want to use this as a way to reform and become more strategic about where they see some of their more exciting projects and things in the future, and where you can make sure that the care sector is doing a better job of looking after the environment, having more of a social conscience. Obviously, as you put it, the care sector, of course, has an inherent social conscience, but then also from a governance perspective as well, how is the kind of the composition of the governance structure for the care organisation structured as well, and where can improvements be made in that respect? Those are exciting things that people can really, really get behind as well. And I think it's, as part of the brand of social care on a macro level, and then also part of the brand of an organization, from a new business perspective, so from an inquiries perspective, and then also from a recruitment perspective, being more mindful of things like the environment are really, really powerful recruitment tools. And I think people will start making more and more decisions around the types of organizations that they choose to align themselves with, because they feel an affinity to them. And I think ESG gives people something to, strategically from a business perspective, it gives people kind of some clear direction around aspirationally where they could be from an environmental, from an ESG perspective. But it filters down within the organization. There are all sorts of almost indirect benefits of doing so as well. I'm interested to hear your view on that as well, because of course you must be having similar conversations with people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's completely right, Simon. And whilst, we've talked about this becoming more of a real area of focus for investors, I think you're right. It's actually becoming much more of an area of focus for wider stakeholders in an organisation, from people that you're looking to recruit to your existing workforce, to people who are potentially going to use your services, even, people in your supply chain who are supplying you with goods and services. I think everyone is so much more interested in this. And, we see that ourselves when we go out to recruit or talk to people about doing work with them. We get asked much more questions now about what we're doing to protect the environment and what we're doing from a social responsibility perspective. And I think that's the same, across all sectors, including care. So this isn't just about something that can, broaden out the pool of investors that you can go out to, or potentially offer you cheaper funding. It can, as you say, help with recruitment. It can help in terms of your existing workforce feeling, that they're working for an organisation that cares about these things in a positive way. I think there are also, additional benefits from, for example, if you look at your properties and improve things like insulation, or make the heating or cooling systems more efficient, then that also has a real benefit for residents in care homes. So, people who are living in the homes day to day, that really benefits them. And it can also really help with the costs that an organisation faces, if sort of using the environmental example again. But if you can reduce carbon emissions, increase your energy efficiency, then you're likely to reduce your overall operating costs, mainly by reducing, high energy bills, which we know are a challenge for a number of providers. So that's another added benefit. And then I guess also there's benefits, and I think there's also then changes that are going to happen in the future that mean really people are going to have to look at this, aside from the benefits, just because of expectations. I wouldn't be a lawyer if I didn't talk about legislation, but I think we are likely to see more legislation around this in the future, maybe not in the very near future, but in the sort of medium to long term. At the moment, there is legislation out there that only applies to really large organizations. So for example, last year we had regulations that came in that required really large companies and large financial institutions to make information disclosures regarding what they're doing in terms of their impact on the climate. But I think, given that the government's committed to achieving net zero by 2050, we're likely to see more legislation and regulations in this area, and that could ultimately trickle down to smaller organizations. So I think with all the sort of benefits that we've talked about, and also the potential that there may be requirements coming further down the line, really now is a very good time for organizations to be starting to really think about ESG targets and strategies and things that they can start putting in place now.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I mean, one would hope that because of the positive outcome of, to a certain extent, adhering to the ESG framework, that people would be, let's almost say, like philosophically aligned or inclined, let's say, to wanting to direct their business in a way which is more mindful of the kind of fundamental pillars of ESG. But there are, as you say, that it's likely that we're going to end up in a world where this is going to be part of the legislation and things. So it makes sense for people to kind of get a bit ahead of the game. I don't want to underplay also the importance of the funding implications of ESG as well. Because am I right in saying that? So from an equity investment and then from a debt finance funding perspective, that the ESG framework is for people looking to deploy capital or to lend money, that the criteria is basically set from a financial perspective and to help guide them where to lend and where to deploy capital. Is that the kind of originally where the ESG framework almost came from, or have I misinterpreted that somewhat?
No, I think that's right. So I think a lot of equity investors now, for example, will have, when they're doing due diligence on organizations and talking to them about whether they can make an investment. I know from speaking to people who work at those investors and from what our clients have dealt with, that they're provided now with effectively sort of ESG questionnaires as part of that process. So, there'd be certain questions around certain areas of ESG, different from investor to investor, no one size fits all, but and investors aren't necessarily expecting people to be able to tick all the boxes in those questionnaires, but certainly as part of the process want to find out what people are doing in those areas. And similarly with banks, we know that certainly for certain banks, as part of the credit process now, ESG is considered, whereas it might not have been a number of years ago. So there's sort of that aspect to it. And then also from a funding perspective, there are kind of products as well that are specifically designed around ESG, which can help in terms of funding for sustainability products or projects, or that might offer cheaper funding if certain targets are met. So I can briefly explain the differences between those if that would help.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I'll just to make sure that I've interpreted what you've explained there. So you've got ESG capital and funding that can be made available to fuel growth of care organizations. and that they will have their own frameworks that they will endeavor to, or at least encourage their clients to be able to adhere to have some type of, somewhere between an inclination towards wanting to implement a strategy and having a strategy in place, and to actively encourage them to follow the principles of ESG, and that would enable them to benefit from probably a wider pool of either capital or funding. And then on top of that, kind of almost like that kind of fundamental layer, I guess if somebody was to say, right, okay, so we've got a fleet of 300 vehicles, I'm making this up, of course, but like we've got a fleet of 300 vehicles or whatever the number might be, or we want solar panels on our roof. Are you saying that like the funding specifically for those types of products or services that fit very snugly within that ESG framework, that there are kind of favorable finance options available for those particular types of things? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So there are green, what are known as green financing products out there, which typically would be, you know, a loan to fund a specific green project. So that means the proceeds of the funding are used in a green or sustainable way. So that could be to retrofit a portfolio of properties, or it could be to install low carbon heating systems. So these are products where you can obtain funding for particular green purposes, ESG purposes. And then there's another set of funding products called sustainability linked products. And these are products where you can use the funding, so use the proceeds of a loan for whatever you want. It, you know, it might just be, you know, for general working capital purposes, or to make acquisitions, or for whatever purpose you want to use the funding for. But you'll agree with the funder at the outset some sustainability linked targets. So things that you're going to agree to do. So it could be to, you know, achieve a certain level of EPC across a number of properties, or it could be linked to diversity at board level, or reducing a pay gap by a certain amount. And the way these products work is that if you hit those targets, then you will reduce the pricing that you're paying for that product. So using a loan, for example, if you achieve the targets that you've agreed with the bank for that loan within the time frame you've agreed, then the interest that you pay on the loan would reduce slightly. So you're correct. So in addition to, you know, the fundamental point is that you're likely to be able to access a wider range of funders and investors if you can demonstrate ESG credentials. But then if you're able to take it to the next level, there might also be opportunities to, you know, obtain cheaper funding from those lenders and investors. And equally, if you look at putting together a strategy and you think, actually, I need funding in order to be able to do this, then there are options out there from that perspective as well.
Sure, that makes loads of sense. Thanks for breaking that part down. You mentioned an acronym, EPC. Sorry, I've not heard of that before. I just thought I'd double check and make sure I've got that one.
Oh, sorry, Energy Performance Certificate. So now most properties, I'm not a property lawyer, so apologies if I get this wrong, but I think all properties have a level of EPC, and you know, we sometimes see in loans that borrowers and companies will commit to, you know, they're going to improve the energy efficiency of properties and commit to getting that EPC to a better level, and they'll demonstrate that through getting up-to-date EPC certificates that show that they've achieved that.
Got you. No, that makes sense. I knew I'd heard of the acronym somewhere, but yeah, of course. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're buying a care home or a residential property. There's always an EPC rating. It's there's like a color coding method, isn't it? Depending on where you are, I understand. So yeah, no, that makes sense. Took me a moment to catch up. So thank you for explaining that point. Okay, so people watching and listening this, if they're not already minded to be thinking about ESG and ESG strategy, will probably be thinking something along the lines of, well, okay, so this sounds great. It sounds like a worthwhile thing to be able to do. There's obviously lots of benefits of adhering to the fundamentals of ESG. Like, how do you, like, where do you even start? Because obviously in a world, I always say this, but I don't know any care leaders that aren't time poor. So like, what are the basics that they have to grapple with to begin with, and like, where can they take things once they've got the kind of the wheels in motion as such?
Yeah, and I think this is a really important question, Simon, because, you know, this is the thing that I think a lot of people find daunting about ESG is where do I start? I haven't done anything yet. Where do I start? And you know, I think that the important thing for everyone to remember is you're not going to be able to do everything all at once. This is something that's going to take time, but the important thing is just to get started, you know, start taking small steps and start building your strategy. And really the fundamentals of any ESG strategy are to set targets. So, you know, just really think about what you want to achieve and you know, things that are relevant to your organization. Develop strategies to achieve those targets. So think about how you're going to get there. And then really look at how you can measure your progress on that ESG journey and show people how if you're achieving those targets. So I think breaking it down, there are a few things people really can do to get started and that we would usually recommend. And I think firstly, I would say, you know, talk to people, speak to your peers, you know, reach out to similar organizations in the sector to learn what they're doing and to avoid reinventing the wheel. I know I said earlier on that there are more than 50% of organizations don't have an ESG strategy, but there are a proportion of them that do. And actually, you know, there's some organizations now that have information about their ESG policy on their websites as well. So I think, you know, talk to people and actually have a look on the websites. That can be helpful just to find out what other people are doing. It won't all be relevant to you, but some of it might be. And then ideally look at a mixture of short-term and long-term targets. So you could look at things you could start doing, small steps you could take in the short term that would start building momentum. And then, you know, whilst you're thinking about and looking at putting longer term, higher impact projects into motion. So, for example, you could look at, you know, we see some organizations are doing things around recycling at their premises and just general waste management. And maybe there's something you can do around that to just get started. But also don't forget to look at what you're already doing. Because I think that the overarching theme here is that there's a lot of organizations that probably are already doing very positive things, but maybe just don't have targets around how they're going to progress those or aren't actively reporting on them. So, for example, it could be that you have a recruitment strategy that is aimed at improving the diversity of your organization, but maybe just look at putting specific parameters in place around that and how you're going to measure it. I think we've talked a lot, obviously, about banks and investors, and I would say also speak to your funders, to your banks and investors. You know, the people that you deal with at your funder, the organizations they work for are likely to have ESG policies in place. They're likely to understand quite a lot about ESG or have people within their organizations who do. And generally I find they're really quite happy to talk about ESG and see that as a positive thing. So they could help you come up with a plan, you know, even if you don't have any of the types of products in place or aren't looking to put them in place. I think they can be a good sounding board and give you a view. And then I guess also this isn't just something that you should discuss at senior level. We talked earlier about how actually ESG can have a really positive impact in terms of recruitment, and that it's something that the workforce are really becoming more interested in and engaged with. And, you know, I guess I would also say, you know, talk to your members of staff, share your plans and thoughts with them, and sort of set parameters within which they can share their ideas with you, because, you know, they're on the ground every day. They might be seeing things that they think could be improved, or just have some ideas around what you're already doing in terms of positive change. So yeah, talk to people at all levels. I guess the key is to start having conversations and just start taking small steps whilst looking to build that overall strategy. But, you know, it's not going to happen in a day, but just start and break it down would be the best advice.
I guess you've almost got like, there's a number of phases there. There's almost like research, speak to funders, investors, etc. Speak to your team, find out more about ESG, maybe what other organizations are doing and things. Because to your point, like there's probably actually quite a lot that's already happening within care organizations that they won't necessarily kind of go, oh, that's an ESG thing, we should document this, create a strategy around it. So it may be that there's 5, 10, 15 brilliant things that are already happening that all they need is a little bit of I say sophistication, just a bit of a process, some as you say, some targets, etc., that you can already start to measure and say, right, okay, this is how we're making a positive impact. It might not even be that you introduce anything new for a period of time, because it's just a case of, right, we're doing all this great stuff already. We just need to do a better job of documenting it and giving ourselves an opportunity to optimize the things that we're already doing. Just by undergoing that process, by making it a thing, by getting people talking about the fundamentals of ESG, people are likely to say, oh, right, you know what would be fascinating? We see, I'm just trying to think, I was having a conversation with somebody about employing more males into frontline care worker roles as an example. How do you go about doing that? That could be seen as a diversity and inclusion strategy. Like, what are you doing in regards to that? How are you making sure that you have more of a balance within the team? And I mean, that's at the frontline level. At the senior leadership team, I'd say there's probably the imbalance then flips the other way around. So maybe what are the opportunities to be able to improve from that perspective as well? So you can see how everyone's probably got an unintentional the basis of an ESG strategy there anyway. It's like, what have you got today, and then how can you keep improving that? Because to your point, this isn't the type of thing that you just, Rome wasn't built in a day, right? You've got what you've got. You implement the things that you've got, the brilliant things that you're already doing, and then maybe shine a bit of positive light on it. And then it's the same as anything. It's those 1% improvements that you can add as you go through the process. And as long as you're documenting that journey and seeing the positive impact compound over time, you've got a story then that you can share with, whether it be investors or funders, or whether it be your workforce or your potential customers or potential new team members, all of that type of stuff. You've got a narrative that you can hang all of this type of stuff off. And that's where you're taking it from the kind of the nuts and bolts practical type stuff all the way through to the strategic brand, really high impact things that you then turn into a story that you can that people can get bought into and excited about, because this particular organization takes this really, really seriously. They're mindful of the fundamentals of ESG as a whole. So it's probably one of those things that maybe sounds like a bigger job than it is. Obviously it needs due time, care and attention, but there's probably some brilliant stuff that's already happening that just needs a little bit of work just to shine that light on the great work that's already happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
Talk to me about the future of that ESG then, because I can remember having a conversation with my wife, who's now the COO of the Care Leaders Network. She used to work for Clifford Chance, so big law firm. She ran their global alumni program, and I can remember her mentioning ESG about 10 years ago. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know what that is. You're going to have to explain this to me. And she explained it to me then. And that was when it was, I guess, far more conceptual, because again, the concept has been around for quite a long time. We're now getting to a point where people are more mindful of their social responsibility, their the diversity and inclusion, the environment, all the fundamentals of ESG. Like, I think we've done a good job of framing where we are today. Like, where do we go from here? Like, what does that all look like?
I think it's interesting
because you're right, it's been around for a while and people have been talking about it for a while, and I think there was some people who thought a number of years ago, is this another sort of buzzword that will be around for a short while and then we'll not hear about it again. But there's so much, climate change is so important. What's happening with the environment is so important, and as we've talked about, people care so much more about things like social responsibility, and people want to work for organizations that are diverse and inclusive, that this isn't going to go anywhere. It's just, I think, going to become more of the norm. Just ultimately, every organization will have some kind of ESG strategy. It'll be at differing levels, but that's where we'll end up. But I think, as far as the care sector goes, I think that's really exciting because, as we've discussed, actually, organizations are well placed to be able to demonstrate these credentials. And from looking at it from a funding perspective, I am seeing now more and more investors and funders that perhaps haven't invested in this sector before, that are interested in doing so now, not only because it's viewed as a robust sector for investment at the moment, but also because of those ESG credentials. So I think that's only going to help keep attracting more investment. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is consistency, in terms of people knowing how to report on this, and how organizations are benchmarked against other organizations or standards that apply across the board. I think in an ideal world, there would be a sort of standard way that organizations can report on their ESG credentials, but with something like ESG, it's not possible. We've seen certain sectors that have introduced some level of consistent reporting standards. So, for example, we've seen that in social housing, where they have the sustainability reporting standard for social housing, and that's a sort of framework of KPIs that housing associations can report against. It's a voluntary framework, and banks and investors have signed up to that. But that, I don't think that translates across to all sectors, and certainly, in care, there's a much greater range of organizations, and there's no sort of one size fits all approach. But I still think we will get to a position where there'll be more guidance out there for organizations, and we'll develop more of a consistent approach in terms of reporting. And I think one of the really positive things is that there are a number of people in the sector now who are really looking at this. And I don't know if you've heard about the Social Care Sustainability Alliance, which has been established by representatives from a cross-section of organisations. So Barclays are involved in that, and there are other advisors and operators as well who are involved in that. And they're sort of really looking at how they can help social care providers across the UK make meaningful and impactful changes. So there is work being done in the sector and progress being made overall. I think the fact that we're talking about it today, that a lot of events I'm going to now, there are discussions happening about it, so people will naturally start to share ideas and help each other with how they can progress this. But I think overall the sector has a really positive message to tell when it comes to ESG, and that's only going to keep attracting more investment, which is a really good thing.
What a great way to round things up. Thank you so much for your time, Deborah. You've explained I think the most important parts of ESG, I think this is a conversation that will evolve. You know, that was your kind of last point here, the fact that it's ESG as a concept is something that's developing all of the time. And as people become more mindful of ESG and the strategies that they'll look to implement, there will become more, I guess, more consistency within the care sector around. So what works, what doesn't work, what are the things that need to focus on, what are the areas where maybe the sector's got blind spots, and hopefully collectively through things like the Sustainability Alliance, we're doing lots of work with this within the Care Leaders Network as well. Just that kind of collective mindset of people being able to just talk about stuff that's relevant to ESG, talk about all of the important aspects of the program. We'll look back on this in a year's time, hopefully, and say, right, we've made some real progress. And then 3, 5, 10 years down the line, we'll be looking back and think to ourselves, wow, like how far have we come in that period of time, which will be a brilliant vantage point to have. But as I say, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and let's try and make sure that we get that next conversation maybe in 12 months' time to review where we've got to from an ESG perspective.
Yeah, that would be great. Great to talk to you. Thanks, Simon.